Chapter 14. Mission 22, We'd be happy with any data at all, really, Part 3 of 6. Back on Equus, while Cherry slept, Rainbow Dash successfully landed Amakitas again, 397. The instant after the post-landing interview ended, every reporter and camera pony in the greater Baltimore area jumped onto every airship, sky chariot and Pegasus-towed cloud available and rushed south to Eden. Now Cherry was awake, suited up again, and ready for orbital maneuvers, fully aware that the eyes of the world were on her, and not metaphorically. Through the tiny nose cone window she glimpsed something large, shadowy, and lumpy, the dark side of Minmus. She'd seen Minmus earlier. She'd gone on Eva before her rest period to take preliminary photos, to conduct certain experiments with the scientific equipment, and, to be honest, to get a little bit of elbow room. Being in a spacesuit floating in space was, in some small way, less claustrophobic than being out of the suit inside the Mark I capsule. But then it had been tiny. Now it was. Well, for a planet it was tiny, but for a thing she was flying towards it loomed like a shadowy corn puff the size of all Equestria, 398. This is real, she thought. I'm actually going to another world. It feels like I've left Equus altogether. That's really weird. But she didn't have time right that moment for self-contemplation. The initial orbital insertion burn was coming up in not that many minutes, and she needed to focus on stopping the ship. Eden, 22, Cherry called out. Coming up on 10 minutes to orbital burn. Preparing to adjust attitude for burn, over. We copy, 22, Chrysalis replied from a million kilometers away. Go for attitude adjustment. Cherry smirked. Ooh, she growled, I'm an evil queen and everything makes me grumpy. Grr. Grr. I'm mean and nasty and definitely don't read trashy romance novels and I puke up any food except vanilla cupcakes. Grr, grr, grumble mumble. After barely a pause, Chrysalis's voice drawled back, 22, we show negative, repeat no joy on attitude adjustment. We read you as still being a geeky pink pony, negative on future world conquest and subjugation of the masses, over. Not only was she not angry, but she sounded quite amused. Darn. Request permission for second attempt. I'm quite sure I could conquer some pukwudgies. That's a negative, 22, Chrysalis drawled. Our readings here show pukwudgies not at all impressed. Confidence of future attempts being successful is 0, repeat 0%. By the way, burn in 8 minutes, 45 seconds mark. 22 copies negative on attitude adjustment, Cherry said. What did I do wrong? You just weren't born to it, 22. Not everyone is born to greatness like I am. Cherry snorted. All right, fun over. Turning the ship now. Eden copies. For most of the trip out to Minmus, Cherry had aimed the ship directly at the sun. This allowed the 2 solar panels, fitted on either side of the capsule, to both catch the light and keep the electric batteries topped off. Also, this kept the ship pointed more or less at Minmus, which meant, now, that a retrograde orbital insertion burn meant turning the ship's nose away from both the sun and Minmus. The obvious consequence of this hadn't occurred to Cherry, or anyone else, until she completed the tumble over on reaction wheels and steadied the ship again. Maneuver complete, ready for burn, she said, and then noticed the electrical charge readout ticking down. Eden, I'm showing 0 charge on the solar panels. Am I reading this right, over? A pause, a more significant pause than the brief pause Chrysalis had used to decide on her reaction to Cherry's teasing. Yeah. That's affirmative, 22, the Changeling Queen's voice said, each word coming out slowly. We don't think that'll affect the ship making the burn. Well, what's causing it? Cherry asked. I'm not in Minmus's shadow, am I? Another pause. No. You're in your own shadow, Chrysalis said at length. Von Braun tells me that the landing stage is blocking all sunlight to the solar panels. You'll need to flip the ship back over again once the burn is complete. Well, that's stupid, Cherry Berry grumbled. Can't we put those panels somewhere where the rest of the ship won't be in the way? Tell some pony to get on that, will you? We'll see what we can do, 22, Chrysalis said. 5 minutes to orbital burn. Cherry acknowledged the time stamp, checked the burn duration notes on her scratch pad, and waited. 5 minutes and one short burn later, the lander was in an orbit roughly 100 kilometers above Minmus. 2 burns after that, the orbit had dropped to an apoapsis of 10 kilometers by a periapsis of 9.7 kilometers. The first burn roused cheers and celebration on Equus, but Cherry heard none of it. Instead she focused on her job, performing the genuinely more dangerous second and third burns with no real fanfare. Then, with the ship parked as low as it was safe to go without a pilot constantly on the controls, the sciencing began. Footnote 397. Almost perfectly. A little bit of thrust from the engines had been necessary to get the ship online for the runway, but it got there as designed, wheels down and rolling on the first pass. The emergency parachutes remained undeployed. 398. It was actually smaller than that, in diameter at least. In terms of surface area, though, it probably dwarfed the land region where Celestia's rule held sway. End footnotes. Day 6 of Mission 22 began with another cherry-laden meal, 399, followed by an EVA for more science experiments. This all went by routine, and 2 hours after waking up Cherry was back in the ship and ready for the main part of the day's activities, temperature scans. The Royal Astronomical Society had commissioned CSP to perform temperature scans at various points near Minmus, and at one particular point on the surface, a highland region well away from the frozen lake beds where they'd intended to land. The procedure was risky, but at the moment the ship had enough fuel in theory for lots of orbital maneuvering, an attempt at landing with possible abort, and a second landing on the lakes. But the in-flight temperature scans had to be made and reported before landing, and those would take quite a lot of orbits. And, in a couple of cases, suborbital flights. 2 of the 5 scans required altitudes lower than the highest point on Minmus's surface, which meant as soon as the temperature scan was done Cherry would have to boost right back into a higher orbit to avoid a crash. Cherry felt the sides of her mouth trying to touch her ears. She couldn't stop grinning. I'm flying in the skies of a whole other world. She thought to herself. I'm buzzing a planet. Okay, not so much a planet. But it's big and round, so it's close enough. Okay, 22, Chrysalis's voice called out, the second temperature scan is coming up on this orbit on the dark side of Minmus. We want you to skim the surface at 5100 meters altitude or less. Navigation data is being relayed to your nav ball now. Roger. The first scan, a high-altitude scan, had been cleared not long after entering low orbit the previous day. Calculating my burn now. After Dragonfly's flight, Cherry had insisted on training in the use of the new onboard trajectory computer. After sim wrestling with the tiny screen and the unintuitive controls, she'd been grateful for the practice, and never more so than now. On the screen she saw a little grey circle meant to be Minmus, a little glowing hoop which was her orbit, one bright pip for her current position, and a little circle indicating the target zone. That, plus a bunch of numbers which made sense to computers but not to her, was all she had to go with that and gut instinct, 400. Okay. So, I have to guess right about thrust and vector 1/4 of the planet away, then make any corrections while I'm in the shadow of the moon and can't see anything, and hope I got it right, or else the last thing I'll ever hear will be a cross between crunch and pop. No pressure. Literally, if I buck this up. Or Eden, this is 22, she said. Going manual for suborbital flight, repeat going for suborbital flight. Or Eden copies. Good luck, 22. Cherry turned the ship, clamped her eyes on the trajectory readout, and gave the ship 3 seconds of 10% thrust. The trajectory dipped, and a new marker popped up showing a new periapsis not far beyond the target zone. 4.7 kilometers. And yes, fully above the surface, at least on this orbit. Good. Okay, Oriton, burn complete, and my trajectory looks good, Cherry said. We confirm, 22, Chrysalis said. We'll keep you posted. Cherry relaxed in her harness and watched her altimeter counting the meters down as the ship descended. The ship had 2 altimeters, the orbital one, which calculated from sea level, 401, and the surface altimeter, in the form of a dial gauge that twitched up and down as the rolling, uneven surface of Minmus passed below. That twitching gave her pause for thought. At the moment she flew above a hilly area like the hills that forced Mission R4 to leave after the briefest of touchdowns. Judging by the wild swings of the surface altimeter, some of those hills and valleys were radical enough that, here on the dark side of Minmus, she wouldn't have any warning whatever if and when the ground reached up to swat her out of the sky. Don't think about that. The computer says you're clear. Focus on the other altimeter. So Cherry did, as it counted down, nice and steady, 5,700 meters, 5,600 meters, 5,500 meters, and so on. In what seemed like no time at all it dropped below 5,100 meters, just as a yellow light came on the controls. You're entering the target zone now, 22, Chrysalis called. Check the thermometer. Cherry flipped the switch for the thermometer, then a second switch for the radio transmitter. Sending readings now, she said. 10 seconds later, the amber light turned red. No joy on the scan, 22, Chrysalis said. Cycle the switches and let's try that again. No joy. Cherry stifled any further words, reached down, and turned the thermometer and transmitter off, then back on again. The light went back to yellow. How about now? No, it still shows negative, Chrysalis said. A moment later, the light on Cherry's controls turned red again. No time for a third attempt. Get back to safe orbit and we might come back to that one later in the flight. Cherry grit her teeth and said, Copy, Oriton. A brief burst of power directly radial, that is, up and away from the surface below would keep her away from any hidden hills the computer might not know about. Then, once she was up again, she could make a proper maneuvering burn to regain a mostly circular 8-kilometer orbit. Easy peasy, no problem. But, as Cherry tilted the ship for the altitude-raising burn, she asked, Oriton, I was at the right altitude and on the right spot. The thermometer and transmitter both work, right? So what's wrong? We don't know, 22, Chrysalis said. We got your signal just fine, but our computer rejected it. We're working the problem now. For now, focus on the next temperature scan zone. It's a high-altitude scan about 3 orbits from now on the light side of Minmus. That one should be simple. Good. Cherry finished putting the ship in place, goosed the engines for just a second, and then began working on a second burn in a few minutes to recircularize her orbit. She hadn't crashed. She'd flown the ship without incident. And that didn't count, because she was leaving a mission goal behind her, unfinished, that she darn well ought to have had. After the second burn, she decided to have lunch. It, of course, contained cherries. Cherry berry didn't taste it. Footnotes 399. Although the meal was very interesting to Cherry Berry and certain members of her family, it wasn't interesting to anybody else. So we're not telling you what it was, alright, 402. 400. Needless to say, Cherry Berry knew better than to trust her gut instinct on this matter. It was the gut instinct of a naturally land-bound creature. It knew nothing of thrust-to-weight ratios, advanced calculus, or fuel consumption rates. Mostly it knew that it liked cherries and wanted some more, and while Cherry had no problem with that as such, it didn't help with calculating orbital burns. 401. In the case of Minmus, from the surface of the frozen lakes. 402. All right, all right. It was tart cherry oatmeal with walnuts. And yes, she loved it. End footnotes. That's affirmative. 22. We show green on the temperature scan, repeat green. Good work. Cherry Berry snorted as she hung in her flight couch straps. Somewhere below her was the daylight side of Minmus, not that she could see it, since neither of her tiny windows pointed towards the ground. Since her ship was coasting along well above the surface, with no danger of crash and no need for maneuver, all she'd had to do was ride along and wait until the computer told her she was flying through the target zone. Fresh-picked cherries required more effort than that test. But at least she knew now that the test system worked. Okay, 22, Chrysalis's voice continued, there's one more in-flight temperature scan to go. It's coming up on the dark side of Minmus this orbit. The target altitude is below 4,900 meters. That's below safety limits, so be careful. We're uploading targeting info to your computer now. Okay, Oriton, Cherry replied, reaching forward to key the trajectory computer back on. There was the zone, slowly creeping towards her current orbital trajectory on Minmus's night side, well down on the moonlet's southern hemisphere. A quick burn right now would probably be the best choice to get the target altitude, she thought, and so a quick flip of the ship later she gave the landing engines a couple of short, soft bursts. And then a couple more. And then... oops. Cherry had miscalculated just a little. Yes, after the burn she now had a trajectory to come in below the ceiling for the requested temperature scan. The problem was, that same trajectory would bring her up close and personal with the floor, i.e. the frozen surface of Minmus, about 3 minutes later, not far from the South Pole. The Cherry Berry who lived in Ponyville took one look at the trajectory line, which came to a clear and broad break at a certain point on the line-drawn circle on the screen, and wanted to run and scream in total panic. But here and now, with flight controls at her hooftips and plenty of air, 403. Between her and the ground at the moment, the Cherry Berry who flew got the overriding vote. That Cherry stopped, and studied the trajectory, and thought. Okay, so it's a suborbital trajectory. That's fine. Do I have time to do something about it after the temperature scan? 3 minutes, give or take. Yes, that's plenty of time. So, this is not really a problem, is it? Treat it just like the last low-altitude test. Nothing has changed. 22, Oriton, Chrysalis called through Cherry's headset. We show you on a suborbital trajectory after that burn, over. Affirmative, Oriton, Cherry Berry said. I'm on top of it. Significant pause. We copy, 22, the voice came at last. 12 minutes until target zone. Roger, Oriton. And that, so far as Cherry was concerned, was that, aside from a moment of irritation that Chrysalis had called her attention to potential messy death a million miles from home just as she'd got the little screaming panicky voice in the back of her head muzzled. Fortunately, she had 10 minutes to suppress her Ponyville moment, 404. And get her head together. She did this by doing a mental checklist of all the readouts, altitude from 0-5,500 meters and falling, altitude from surface wobbling up and down like a drunken breezy, battery showing 244 and dropping slowly, landing stage tanks at about 48% each, view outside the hatch pitch black. Trajectory map showing directly on course for a pass through the target area marked on the map. By the time she'd checked everything, her pulse rate had dropped, and the desire to run in circles and scream for someone to save her had mostly gone away. And she checked the map again. She still had 9 minutes to lie back and remind herself that, since she was now suborbital, she was technically flying in an alien sky again. The only flaw was, darn it, she didn't quite have enough time to dig out one of the cherry snack packs to celebrate. Footnotes 403. Strictly in the metaphorical sense. Minmus had no atmosphere worth speaking of, and rolling down the window to enjoy the breeze would have been a most foolish thing to do at that point. But in the sense of, am I going to hit anything solid in the next 5 seconds, Cherry's mental point was valid enough. 404. Ponyville moment is Cherry Berry's term for the urge towards mindless panic regardless of whether or not panic is either justified or helpful. The name derives from the fact that Cherry calls Ponyville home, and also from the fact that the citizens of Ponyville have had so much practice panicking at anything between T-Rex invasion and a stampede of cute adorable bunnies that they have raised panic into a high art form. Indeed, in their secret heart of hearts, a good many Ponyville ponies secretly enjoy those moments when they can demonstrate their well-practiced craft, and those ponies consider the property destruction and risk of life a small price to pay in the name of art. End footnotes. 22. This is Oreton, Chrysalis said into the microphone. Midnight had come and gone, and there was a bed calling her name 2 buildings over, 405. That little burst of power has you good for one clean orbit. Just barely, at one point the ship would clear a highland by only 400 meters. We recommend one more burn at apoapsis to raise orbit to a minimum of 6,000 meters, and then free time for the remainder of your flight day. 22 copies. On the telepresence screen, the helmeted face of Cherry Berry smiled, still wide awake and ready to fly. Just give me a minute to recharge the batteries. I just crossed back into daylight. Roger. Also, there's one more high-altitude temperature scan which will happen after the overnight team comes on. The overnight team consisted of old George Cowley in the bullpen, Gordon the Griffin at Capcom, and Dragonfly. Dragonfly, of all bugs, as acting flight director. Not Chrysalis's first choice, but it had been either her or Leonid the Yak, and Chrysalis would rather have dragged Carapace out of the kitchen and stuck him with the headset than put a Yak in charge of not smashing things up. You'll get the target data on your computer before the handover. Okay, Oreton, Cherry said, her face frozen in concentration as she twitched the controls. There, okay. I show apoapsis in 14 minutes. Confirm. Chrysalis caught the tired nod from von Braun. We confirm, 22, she said. And then she noticed something else on the big telepresence screen on the projection of the landing ship, floating above the surface, with the glittery snowy slopes of Minmus speeding along underneath it. There was a tiny black dot keeping pace with the ship. 22, Chrysalis said carefully, please give us current altimeter from surface reading. Altimeter from surface reading approximately 440 meters, Cherry said promptly. You said that was safe, right? Yes, Chrysalis said, not the sinister hissing yes she preferred but the uncertain, worried one she would have squelched if she wasn't so tired. It's just that we can see your shadow below you. On the ground. Really? Wish I could see it. Cherry made a face in her little corner of the projection. But I don't think it's worth flipping the ship over for it. Well, just keep an eye on the altimeter until you make your next orbital burn, okay? Chrysalis asked. All of us down here will sleep better for it. Ah. It's nice to know you care, Your Highness. Chrysalis choked down the hisses and snarls that wanted to come out. You just bring my ship back here in the designed number of pieces, understand, she barked. I don't want to have to waste 2 weeks going up there to rescue you if you screw up. I like you too, Oreton, Cherry said. The projection showed a big, toothy grin on the wall. Chrysalis wanted to throw a brick through it. A big brick. Footnote 405. And also the newest masterwork from Roughly Crinoline, Paperwork Passions, about an attractive young mare who lusted for a study-certified public accountant while the humble but diligent Department of Wagon Vehicles worker attempted to prove his own love. 40-pound triple-layer dresses were somehow involved, including the removal thereof. Chrysalis was looking forward to threatening with death the first changeling who caught her reading it. End footnote. Time passed. Mission 22 made several more loops around the bedazzling pale sphere far, far above Equus. On Equus the sun was raised, 406. And set, 407. And then the silence of space was broken by a squeaky voice, Eden, 22, comms check. We read you, 22, Chrysalis replied. Good morning, and you're go for a landing today. Stand by for some housekeeping details. Good to hear, Eden. Cherry Berry fumbled around the cabin for the notepad and wax pencil. Ready. Separated by 1,000,000 kilometers, Chrysalis and Cherry exchanged a checklist's worth of little chores, trash and waste disposal, ship maintenance checks, final procedures before the landing began. And finally, Chrysalis said, if there's fuel left in the landing stage, we want you to go for a second landing in different terrain. After the second landing, you come home. We've decided to send a robot for the temperature scan that got missed. Did you figure out what went wrong with that? Cherry asked. Transcription error, Chrysalis said. The mission specs, and the computer program provided, had the temperature scan down as above the target altitude. The protocols we wrote up for you, and for us here in Mission Control, listed it as below target altitude. It'll take a couple of days for another try in your current orbit, and we don't want to mess with that or leave you there that long. So we'll send a robot. This is your third day up there. It's going to be a longer trip back than you had going. We want you down as soon as possible, 22. Understood. Roger, Eden, Cherry said. Scrub on further in-flight temperature scans. What about the surface scan? That's still on. The landing site for the temperature scan comes up tomorrow morning our time about dinner time on the mission clock. So we want to attempt that first. Really? I thought the plan was to take the safe landing zone first, on the lake. We changed our minds. We figure if you have to abort the first landing, there will still be fuel for a second one. If you abort the second one or if you have to make a second pass at it, you might not have fuel to get home afterwards. So you're going to the South Polar Highlands first. Okay, 22 copies. We want to make this clear, 22, Chrysalis said firmly. If something goes wrong, even a little, you abort. We don't want you to put the second landing at risk. No problem, Eden, Cherry said. I know what to do. A prolonged silence crossed between the worlds. Okay, 22, Chrysalis said at last. You have free time until 14:30 mission clock. At that point we go through the final descent checklist. Pause. Good luck, 22. Roger, Eden, and thanks. A little metal can connected to 3 bombs floated around a gigantic ball of ice, again and again, high above a distant blue planet the size of a hackberry. Footnotes 406. Again, strictly from the perspective of ponies standing on the surface. What really happened was that an alicorn's magic held the planet and everything on it and nudged its rotation a little bit. This required less magic than actually moving a Class G0 star, but it still qualified as a major miracle. Other species thought the fact that ponies took this miracle for granted twice a day said all any other species ever needed to know about ponies. 407. The same as above, except that whereas most ponies regard footnote number 406 with reluctance and a mug of something caffeinated, most ponies greet this footnote with celebration and relief, and occasionally a nice garden wine. End footnotes. At mission elapsed time 1:58:42 on the capsule's clock, Cherry Berry fired the engines not a short burst like her prior orbital adjustments, but a long, full throttle burn. Below her almost, but not quite, directly below laid the target landing zone, where the Royal Astronomical Society had requested surface readings for whatever reason. The highlands of Minmus rolled up and down not with the suddenness of the areas immediately next to the frozen lakes, but a more gentle gradient that, Faust willing, would allow a relatively level landing. In fact, Cherry noted as she looked out the hatch porthole at the surface below, the surface looked pretty flat from up here. Flat, and glittery, sparkling all sorts of colors here on the daylight side, colors that blurred together into the general aqua-gray that one saw from farther away. But she could only look for a second, just long enough to verify that the terrain was safe for landing. Cherry committed her glance to memory, then turned her attention back to her instruments, which she would need for the rest of the landing. The ship would land in the same position it launched in, which meant Cherry would be lying on her back in the flight couch, in a position where she couldn't possibly see the ground beneath her. That meant relying on 3 instruments: the speed indicator, 408, the altimeter from surface, and the nav ball and its indications of ship orientation, prograde and retrograde vectors, and angle of attack. The speed indicator were down closer and closer to 0. The idea, in theory, was to bring the ship to a complete stop in relation to Minmus's surface, currently 1400 meters below. This would allow a vertical drop that would allow a controlled level landing. In practice, Cherry wanted to allow a little bit of drift, since she'd have to use the engines to slow the final part of the descent anyway. That last burn would let her kill any remaining lateral motion and, at the same time, keep Minmus's weak gravity from hauling her down too quickly and smashing the spindly little landing legs. 409. Or 22, she said, shutting down the engines and returning momentarily to free fall. Deorbit burn complete, entering landing phase. Please confirm proper landing zone. Stand by. 22. Cherry's ears would have flipped backwards in annoyance if they hadn't been covered by her spacesuit headset. Or be advised that gravity has something to say about my ability to stand by. Am I in the right place, affirmative or negative? Negative, Chrysalis's voice grumbled. We're trying to figure out why. Do the best you can with your onboard systems. Negative. Cherry checked the plot on her trajectory indicator. Or the map says I'm right on the money. How small is this zone I'm supposed to hit? We're working the problem. 22, Chrysalis said. Do what you can with your computer, but don't risk the landing over it. If it feels unsafe, abort. Roger, or Cherry grumbled back. 1000 meters and descending, mark. She looked closer at the trajectory plot. The screen was tiny, and it showed only thin and kind of wobbly lines and 2 markers practically on top of one another. But, maybe she was a little west of the zone? Adjusting descent. She tipped the ship a bit, fired the engines for a few seconds, noting her descent speed slowing even as her retrograde vector momentarily vanished from the top of the nav ball. 800 meters and descending at 20 meters per second and accelerating. Descent stage fuel at 37%. We copy. 22. Cherry found the retrograde marker on the ball, reoriented the ship until it lined up with the top of the ball, and waited for a little while. The speed readout slowly ticked upwards, as the marker crawled very slowly up the nav ball. Finally, at 500 meters, Cherry kicked the engines back on, wiggling the ship a little to kill the lateral momentum again. Or if I'm not in the zone now, something's way wrong. I'm committing to landing, and if it works, fine. If not, we'll send a probe. We don't get it either, Chrysalis admitted. We show you as go for landing. Be sure to null out your lateral way before landing. Roger. Cherry kept the engines firing, just above their lowest setting, which gradually decelerated the ship. 300 meters and falling at 15 meters per second, she reported. End of Part 3.